All right, so you wanted to unpack the Harry and Meghan interview with Oprah. And, well, we found a commentator with a very strong opinion on it.
Oh yeah, this will be interesting.
We're really going deep on this one, his whole analysis, like everything from what he thinks Meghan's motives are to, like, the future of the monarchy, even.
Yeah, what really struck me just diving in here is how this commentator, he kind of approaches this interview like a detective at a crime scene. Like every word, every gesture from Meghan, he's analyzing it, convinced there's some hidden agenda under the surface.
He even compares himself to a chess player at one point. Like he's saying, oh, I can see right through all her moves.
Exactly, and I think that's a really important point because that analogy gets to the heart of his argument, right?
Yeah.
He's basically saying Meghan is intentionally manipulating this entire situation. She is very carefully constructing a very specific public image.
And he doesn't even wait for the interview to really start before he starts, like, labeling her as manipulative, even going so far as to say that she's using Harry for fame.
Oh, yeah. And right out of the gate, too, he calls Harry Prince Cuck. So that gives you an idea of the kind of language that he uses throughout this whole thing. But, yeah, like, you can tell this commentator, he seems personally bothered by the fact that, 2 billion people watched their wedding? He sees it as, like, this big spectacle.
It's really interesting that he keeps coming back to that number, 2 billion. But let's actually get into the interview itself a little bit. One of the things he really hones in on is Meghan's claim that she was naive about, like, royal life, going into it.
Yeah, and specifically, he latches on to that moment when Oprah asks, did you do any research beforehand? And she says, no. He interprets that as a calculated move on Meghan's part to appear innocent. He even points to her body language as, like, proof.
Yeah, he says she got defensive when Oprah kind of challenged her on that. To him, what constitutes defensive body language in that moment?
Well, he claims that she crosses her arms and avoids direct eye contact, which to him, that means she's hiding something. Now, we should probably say here that body language interpretation, it's complicated. Experts will tell you, like, you can't draw definitive conclusions based on isolated gestures like that. It could just be, her way of self-soothing in that situation. I mean, it was a high-pressure interview.
Right, exactly. Crossed arms could mean defensiveness, but it could also just mean, like, she's a little uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's very, very subjective. But he goes on, though. He also claims that Meghan's using certain looks, nods, trying to sway Oprah to her side during the interview.
So he's saying that she's manipulating the interviewer, too, basically.
Yeah, and you could say that. And this is where I think his personal feelings about gender roles start to kind of color his analysis, because he makes this, like, sweeping generalization that women like Meghan, they have to work harder to appear nice.
That's a pretty loaded statement, isn't it?
Very much so.
Wow.
And it's not really clear what he's basing that on. Like, where's the evidence for that?
Exactly.
But it's interesting because he brings up this idea again later when he says that no man likes a loudmouth, particularly in an institution like the royal family. So it's almost like he takes issue with Meghan being outspoken. And he sees that as, like, a threat to the monarchy in some way.
Yeah, it's like he even goes so far as to say that if Meghan were a decent person, she would have just, like, quietly accepted her unhappiness and left the royal family without making a fuss, He's basically saying that she's choosing to play the victim rather than taking responsibility for her own life.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into his other accusation, which is that Meghan straight up lied about why Archie wasn't given a title.
Right.
So she claims in the interview that there was no explanation from the royal family about that whole situation. And this commentator is convinced that they did give her a reason, but she's intentionally leaving it out to manipulate the narrative.
He even claims that his lie detector is going off during those moments. But again, this is just his opinion.
Yeah, it's all based on his own, like, subjective interpretation of her words and her tone and her body language. There's no actual concrete evidence to back any of this up.
Right. It's like he's watching a totally different interview than everyone else.
Exactly.
It's almost as if he's, like, already decided that she's lying, that she's trying to be misleading, and then he just interprets everything through that lens.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, right? This tendency to kind of project our own, like, preconceived notions onto these public figures, it's fascinating to me. Because, like, he seems to be holding Meghan to this standard that, one, is totally unrealistic, but also, like, relies on some pretty old-fashioned ideas about women in power.
Like with that loudmouth comment, he keeps going back to that, saying that women in positions like hers should be seen and not heard. basically.
Right, like he sees her outspokenness as this personal attack or something. Like it's disrupting this traditional power dynamic where men like him, they're the authority and women should just be agreeable and, subservient.
It is really jarring to hear some of the stuff he says. Like, he goes on this whole rant about how women ruin everything. And he even uses the example of a woman entering a male-dominated workplace and causing problems by, and I quote here, sleeping around.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that just, it speaks volumes about like his worldview, right? This like deeply rooted idea that women are inherently disruptive, that their presence upsets the balance of power, and any negative consequences automatically their fault.
It's unsettling, to say the least, and while we obviously don't endorse any of this, it's a good reminder that these kinds of opinions, as extreme as they are, do exist, especially online.
Oh, absolutely. And while, we don't condone his language or his opinions, I think it's really crucial to understand like where these viewpoints come from and how they contribute to the very real online harassment and abuse that many women face, including Meghan Markle.
You mentioned earlier, too, that he keeps referencing his own wealth and success, and it almost seems like he's trying to use that as validation for his opinions, as if being wealthy somehow makes him an authority on Meghan Markle's character or something.
Oh, yeah, it's a classic case of, like, wealth is validation. Like, because he's financially successful, that automatically means his opinions are more valuable or insightful than others.
Which is obviously a flawed argument, but it makes you think about the influence of wealth and power, especially in the age of social media, right? Like this guy has a platform and he's using it to construct this very specific narrative about Meghan Markle.
Absolutely. And whether or not people agree with him, his wealth and his online presence, it gives him this like certain level of influence and reach that most people don't have. So it's like he's creating this echo chamber where these extreme views can be amplified and validated without much pushback.
And that's where it gets dangerous, right? It's one thing to hold these opinions privately, but when you broadcast them to a large audience like that, it risks normalizing these viewpoints, legitimizing them. It creates a space where prejudice and misinformation can just flourish.
And it's a sobering thought, this whole thing. It's a reminder that we have a responsibility as consumers of information to be critical, especially online. We can't just accept everything we hear as fact, especially when it's coming from sources that are clearly biased or promoting harmful stereotypes.
It's so easy to get caught up in the gossip and the drama surrounding public figures, but we have to remember that there are real people at the center of these stories, and words have real-world consequences.
100%. It's natural to have opinions about public figures, but we have a responsibility to be mindful of the language we use and the potential impact of our words, especially when they're based on prejudice or misinformation.
It's interesting, though, because in a way, this whole thing with this commentator, as much as he's focused on Meghan Markle, he's also revealing a lot about himself and his own worldview, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and that's often the case, I think, with passionate critiques. They often tell us as much about the person making the critique as they do about the subject of the criticism.
Yeah, it's like they're projecting their own insecurities, their own biases onto these public figures, using them to validate their own perspective on the world.
And in this case, it's this worldview that seems really rooted in traditional gender roles and a resistance to change, especially when it comes to these established power structures.
Yeah.
Like, he seems particularly threatened by Meghan's ambition and her willingness to speak out against what she sees as injustice.
Yeah, he even frames her decision to, step back from royal life as some kind of betrayal, as if she violated this unspoken agreement to never prioritize her own well-being and happiness.
Right, like how dare she?
Exactly. And let's not forget, throughout all of this, he repeatedly calls her a liar, based solely on, his interpretation of her body language and her tone, which we've already established is hardly conclusive evidence.
Yeah, which brings us back to that question of objectivity, right? Can we ever truly be objective when analyzing someone's behavior, especially when we've already formed strong opinions about them?
Because it seems like this commentator is so convinced of his own perspective, he's incapable of seeing Meghan as anything other than the villain he's created in his own mind.
And that's a really crucial point to remember as we navigate this often treacherous water of online commentary and social media discourse, right? Because it's so easy to get caught up in the outrage and the judgment. But we have to we have to try to approach these conversations with a critical eye and with an open mind, remembering that there's often more to the story than meets the eye.
Yeah, it's almost like in trying to take her apart, he's kind of accidentally revealed more about himself than anything else.
Right. And I think this whole deep dive, looking at one man's very, shall we say, strong opinions on Meghan Markle, it's actually revealed a lot about the ways we as a society tend to interpret and judge public figures, especially women.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it shows how our own personal biases, especially around things like gender roles and power dynamics, they really influence how we view these situations.
Yeah.
Even something like a televised interview.
Totally. And this analysis that we've been looking at, as extreme as it is, I think it's a really good illustration of the potential pitfalls of those online echo chambers that we hear so much about, right?
100%.
Because these unfounded accusations and these harmful stereotypes, they can spread so easily in those spaces online when there's no counterargument, there's no accountability.
Yeah, they just go unchecked, and
Yeah.
people just accept it as truth.
And I think, what this really highlights for me is that as people consuming this information, we have to be so much more discerning. We can't just take everything at face value, especially when it's coming from a source that's clearly biased or even pushing these like really harmful stereotypes.
Exactly. And it's so easy to fall into that trap, too, because if someone sounds really certain, if they're really confident, and they present themselves as like an expert on something, then people just go, oh, well, they must be right. But that's not always the case.
Right. It's up to us to be a little bit more critical, to question what we're hearing, and to look for those different perspectives out there.
Absolutely. And I think even when we don't agree with something, it's so important to try to have those conversations with at least a little bit of empathy and respect.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. But after hearing all of this, we want to leave you with one final thought to consider. And it's this. How often do you find yourself drawn to commentary that already aligns with your own biases? And how can you maybe challenge yourself to engage with different viewpoints, even the ones that maybe make you a little bit uncomfortable? Because sometimes that's the only way to get a more balanced, a more informed understanding of, well, really anything.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having me.